Hi, and welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Obviously, I'm not Daniel Davis. He is on a well-deserved vacation. I'm filling in. I'm Larry Johnson from Sonar21.com. And today I am thrilled, delighted, and pleased to be able to have the opportunity to interview Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Now, Ambassador Freeman represents, if you want to have a benchmark of what an American diplomat is supposed to be like, it's Chaz. And what's a diplomat like that supposed to be? Someone who can be the velvet glove, a little soft on the outside as far as smooth, not overtly obnoxious like I tend to be, but underneath the glove, hard as nails and tough. And so, Chaz, listen, thanks so much for doing this today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Okay, what I want us to start with is uh, getting back to how diplomacy is supposed to work. And I want you to watch a clip of former Secretary of State and Director of CIA Mike Pompeo.
When the Biden administration talks about a ceasefire, Hamas gets excited, Tehran gets excited, because that's a great outcome for them. They can repeat, as they have promised to do, they can repeat October 7th again and again and again. It is silly to think about a ceasefire. I hear all those terms. I see this diplomatic scrambling around, and I think what foolishness it is to accept, for America to accept, that Iran is going to impose costs, kill 1,200 Israelis, hold American hostages, and we're simply going to say, hey, let's try and return to the status quo before this. It's dangerous, it's perilous for America, and the Iranians feel like this is victory for them.
So, is diplomatic scrambling around a waste of time?
Well, it certainly is if you have all the fallacies in mind that Pompeo just announced. Iran killed people on October 7th. No, Hamas did a jailbreak, and about half of the people who were killed were actually killed by Israeli forces under the Hannibal Directive. Scrambling around? No. Diplomacy is about persuading someone, an antagonist perhaps, maybe a friend, to see things the way you do and to come to the conclusion that what you want them to do is in their interest to do. That is diplomacy. And it can be accompanied by threats, of course, but it is basically a form of suasion that is heavy on incentives. And what I think you just saw in that clip, a splendid example of why Pompeo was such a disaster as a CIA director and as Secretary of State. He doesn't have his facts straight. He's proceeding from fallacious information. He's making no effort to influence the party that he's talking about. He's just throwing up his hands and calling for bombing, basically. So, diplomacy is also a function of statecraft. Basically, statesmen have three instruments. One is the military, another is the intelligence services, and the third is diplomacy. And the diplomatic element of this ties into the others. So if you're going to start a war, which he's proposing to do, by the way, in that clip, attack Iran rather than try to influence Iran. If you're going to start a war, the first thing you have to do is have a strategy, have objectives, have a war termination plan. Who are you going to end the war with? Is it a forever war? And never lose contact with the enemy, because if you do, the enemy will either surprise you or be so resentful they will do the opposite of what you want them to do. So diplomacy is part of statecraft, and I'm sorry to say that it's pretty much a lost art in the United States at present.
Who, in your judgment, just going back in your experience, did you consider the best Secretary of State, or the one that you felt had the best grasp on both doing the strategic as well as doing the diplomacy?
George Shultz.
Yeah.
He understood what he was trying to do. He was a man of few words. He didn't waste your time. He was a great listener. You know, a Secretary of State has to have 4 characteristics. First, he or she's got to be a strategic thinker, able to conceptualize a strategy. Second, he or she's got to be a great manager, because the Department of State is an abomination in management terms, tremendous challenge. And third, he or she's got to be a terrific listener, because that's how you influence people. And fourth, he or she's got to have the ability to reduce complex policies almost to the bumper sticker level. George Shultz had all of those qualities. So did Colin Powell, I believe, although he was gutted. You can't be effective if the president doesn't listen to you. And his president, George W. Bush, thanks to people around him, basically eviscerated Powell. He wasn't effective.
Yeah. When did you get your first job as a deputy chief of mission? And let me just explain for the folks listening that the path to becoming an ambassador at State Department, which every Foreign Service officer aspires to, proceeds through you. First, you're going to become generally a deputy chief of mission, which means you're supposed to be the one managing and running an embassy.
An embassy is basically, if you think of it in corporate terms, the ambassador's the chairman. He's the public face. He's brought in on major policy issues. But the CEO or the COO, if you will, is the DCM. The Deputy Chief of Mission tries to hold everything together. That's particularly the case in our system, since we have so many amateurs appointed as ambassador who don't really know what they're doing. Right. As the deputy, it's your job to make the ambassador look good and be prepared for when he or she goes into a meeting. But it's also your responsibility to guide the reporting and analysis and to manage the many, many agencies that are present in a U.S. embassy. My first DCM ship was in Beijing, but when I was in DCM in Bangkok, I had 32 government agencies under my guidance. Not all of them under control, but I tried hard. I mean, DEA and CIA were at each other's throats most of the time. But anyway, we made it work.
And one of the things that were FSOs and the Foreign Service differs from the military. In the military, the training is that even if you start off as a corporal or a private, you're trained to do the job for the next level, and you have some experience. And a lot of times, my understanding was people would jump from being a political counselor or an economic counselor, put it as a DCM with absolutely no idea of how to manage.
That's exactly right. It's a failing of our system. I was very fortunate. My first tour abroad in the Foreign Service was in South India, in what was then called Madras, now called Chennai. And Chester Bowles was the ambassador, a great lover of India, and he and I got at cross purposes. I did a variety of things that he didn't like, and so I went off on R&R, rest and recreation in Hong Kong, and while I was gone, he transferred me from the State Department to the U.S. Information Agency, because I had been a judge in the 1967 Miss India contest, and I'm the only foreign speaker to have keynoted the Indian National Congress annual meeting. So he figured I was terrible, because I showed him up in a number of ways in terms of reporting on India, and I did some consular things that represented both the law and my conscience, which he didn't like. Anyway, he was very kind. Suddenly, at age 23, I had a multi-million-dollar budget and 300 people working for me. And you learn, you sink or swim. And so I had significant management experience, but most people are exactly in the position you talk about. I would say this is the same in a lot of contexts. Think about university professors. Let's say they may be really good at research or perhaps teaching, although a lot of them don't care too much about teaching. And then suddenly they're made the head of a department and they have administrative responsibilities. And they have not a clue how to carry those out.
Right.
So this is a Peter Principle issue, and there are Foreign Service officers who think their job is to hang around in Washington and be courtiers, securocrats, if you will, make policy. I always thought it was much more interesting to implement policy. That's where the rubber really hits the road.
Well, in one area I want to explore, because particularly given your experience in China, we seem to be at a period now with respect to our foreign policy that we don't talk to our adversaries. All we do is threaten them. Now, can you draw upon your own experience of how would we deal with the Chinese when in terms of, we weren't necessarily friends, but doesn't mean we don't, we act like high school teenagers and refuse to talk to each other.
This is a very good question. When I was Assistant Secretary of Defense, there was a coup d'etat in Nigeria. And the State Department, over my strong objections, insisted on removing the defense attachés from Lagos. It was then the capital, later Abuja. My point was, these are the guys who know the new rulers. Do you want to get anything done or not? I absolutely keep them there. We have a bad habit of imagining that our talking to people is somehow a great favor to them. It isn't. The reason you maintain contact with another government and other people is because, first of all, you have a chance to explain your point of view directly in the most effective terms that you can, terms that they understand. Because if a diplomat is any good, he or she is on the ground and knows the local culture and language and is able to and has built up some credibility with interlocutors. And second, you can listen to them and hear why they have the crazy ideas they do, and then try to develop a strategy to change their ideas. I think you mentioned the Chinese. The Chinese have set a standard in this regard, which we ought to really study. When they had their war with New Delhi, the Sino-Indian border war in 1962, they kept their embassy in New Delhi. They did not withdraw it, even though they were at war. Why? Because it's exactly when you're at war that you most need to talk with your enemy. They did the same thing in 1979 with the Sino-Vietnamese war. They kept their embassy open. We close at things we think, we spent a long time, for example, with the North Koreans, who are, really hard-boiled, nasty people for the most part, in the government anyway. We spent a long time saying to them, basically, we're not going to talk to you about your nuclear program till you come out with your hands up. Come out with your hands up, then we'll talk to you. But you want to get them to get their hands up, you got to go talk to them. And that is something that Donald J. Trump understood, even if he botched the effort.
Yeah, well, and with respect to China, when did we basically trash the Kissinger-Nixon agreement with the Chinese, as far as telling the Chinese, okay, we accept the one China policy, and then the shift to, hey, we're going to basically support Taiwanese independence?
It was a progressive abandonment of our commitments. I mean, we made 3 commitments to normalize relations with China. This happened in December 1978 under Jimmy Carter, but the terms had been negotiated basically by Nixon with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong 6 years or 7 years before that. And the 3 conditions were no official relations with Taipei, which we had, of course, championed during the Cold War as the sole legal government of all of China plus Mongolia, Chiang Kai-shek, no military presence on the island, where we had nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and no defense commitment. Expression of concern about the status of Taiwan, but no explicit defense commitment. We progressively abandoned all three of these conditions. There's a building a $230 million building in Taipei that looks exactly like an embassy and has Marine Guards in it. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and others feel free to go there on an official basis. So much for not having official relations. There are military on the island now, again, supposedly training. They're actually even in Quemoy, maybe Matsu, for all I know, the offshore islands that were the subject of a great crisis at the end of the 1950s. We never had a significant troop presence there at all. Now we do again. And, finally, our president, Biden, has on 4 occasions announced a commitment to defend Taiwan. So basically, we've abandoned all that. And in many ways, we're back to the era of the Warsaw talks. Everybody's forgotten. 1949, the communists took over China. A lot of foreign service officers were blamed for that, which is a little unfair. They foresaw it, but they didn't cause it. And then from 1949 to 1979, the official position of the United States was the government of China is in Taipei. They're not a government in exile because Taiwan is part of China. And by the way, the Republic of China, which they call themselves, is still the legal government of Outer Mongolia. That was our position. For 23 years, we argued that at the UN. I used to do that. We were so good at our diplomacy that we got away with this nonsense for 23 years until our bluff was called, because it was perfectly obvious that the government of China was in Beijing, not in Taipei. And the fact that Taipei was sitting in the UN Security Council speaking for China was just, pretty ludicrous. But it's an example of how we can get on a cause and create a narrative and dig into it and ignore anything that contradicts it.
Well, China is a potential flashpoint for, it seems that we're going to be walking in. We wanted to create a new problem for ourselves. But let's shift to what's going on with Israel and Iran. And Gary, let's play the Pat Ryder commentary at the Pentagon from the other day, please.
But isn't it important at this critical time in history that you send a very clear signal to Iran that if they launch a major attack on Israel and or its proxies, the U.S. military will attack Iran? Don't you need to send a clear signal about what Iran, if they do it, if they cross it, you will attack them?
I think we are sending an extremely clear signal, which is that we are going to support the defense of Israel, as evidenced by the capabilities that, one, we already retain in the region, and two, the additional capabilities that we're flowing into the CENTCOM and EUCOM AOR.
Now, I haven't seen Top Gun 2. My understanding is the script involves U.S. military attacking Iran, flying jets into Iran. So, Mr. Ambassador, tell me what you think.
First of all, there's just to quote a Chinese military adage, since the success in war depends on surprise, and surprise usually depends on deception. There's a Chinese military adage that says, no repetition of a winning move. And Iran has already been provoked with an Israeli attack on its embassy in Damascus into an exchange of missiles with Israel, which they deliberately told us in advance was not intended to kill anybody. They sent slow, obsolete drones on a 6-hour flight from Iran to Israel and cruise missiles following them to make sure that the Israelis and we and the Jordanians whose airspace he's had to cross would be able to defend against them. They then sent some hypersonic missiles in very precise targets in Israel, including the swimming pool at the officers' club in an airbase in the Negev. And they've done that. The assumption is they're going to repeat that, but with gusto. I doubt that very much.
Yeah.
I think Israel crossed a red line with finally, Israel has been in the habit of assassinating Iranians for quite a while. And now it assassinated a Sunni leader, Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, during the presidential inauguration when he was a state guest in a state guest house in Tehran. You can't get more insulting than that. That is an affront to Iranian honor, and they will retaliate, as they have said. But I suspect, I fear, that their retaliation is going to be counter-assassination. They're not going to do again what they did on April 1st.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to respond to the July 31st provocation by Israel, but they will do it in a way that befuddles us because they don't want a war with us. And I don't think the answer to a provocation by Israel, an incredible provocation, both a simultaneous assassination in Tehran and one in South Beirut, I don't think the answer to that is to reaffirm your intention to defend Israel no matter what it does. That is exactly the policy which has brought us to a point where we have no credibility in the world. We are overextended. We are facing the danger of a wider war, not only in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, but also in the Taiwan Strait, because we've forgotten how to talk to people. We've forgotten how to reason with them. We've forgotten how to send messages. The message is the only message we know how to send is moving naval vessels or Air Force planes around, and that is not an effective way to conduct foreign policy.
Well, I was telling Gary earlier that one thing that most people don't understand is all of the naval forces and combat air that we've deployed to that area is if Iran chooses to use one or two targeted ballistic missiles at a military or intelligence site in Israel, none of our military hardware there can stop it. I mean, it's completely useless. So,
well, that was actually illustrated back on April 1. We had to make a maximum effort. We still couldn't stop hypersonic missiles getting through.
right.
They made their point, and they made it in a way that was restrained. And I think the Israelis got the message. What they did on July 31 was a combination of things. One, trying to restore their own morale, their own belief in the effectiveness of their military and intelligence services with these assassinations. Try to deter others by restoring their reputation for ruthless invincibility. And also, in the case of Mr. Netanyahu, trying to do what he's been trying to do for decades, namely get the U.S. into a war with Iran. And this guy, and I don't know who that press guy was asking the question, but he's basically serving Mr. Netanyahu's effort to produce a wider war, because there are people in Israel, and apparently they include the prime minister, who want an apocalypse. They think Israel would benefit from it. I don't believe so. And I think Mr. Netanyahu has made a number of mistakes. And I know that his own military, his own intelligence services, and many people in Israel want him out. And today I saw an op-ed in Haaretz, the great liberal Israeli newspaper, by Ehud Barak, former prime minister, former chief of staff of the armed forces of Israel, basically calling for a coup to get rid of Netanyahu, because he has led his country into the abyss. He has no way out. And, to do what that correspondent suggested would be to fall right into the trap that Netanyahu has set.
Well, you know, I've heard from two different friends who are still active or access to the U.S. intelligence community that the U.S. intelligence community has adopted the analytical position. I mean, they've all come to the conclusion that Iran is not going to respond because Iran's afraid, and that's why Iran is delaying. Now, as I've looked at it, I see Iran doing, uh, let's call it the mature, or being the adult in the room. Because the first thing they did was get the United Nations Security Council to convene, where the Iranian ambassador made the case of saying, hey, either you guys enforce your international rules, or we're going to have to act according to Article 51 and defend ourselves. You figure it out. But if you don't want to do that, you're leaving us only this option. Then they follow it up with this meeting just the other day with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 Islamic nations. And basically, Iran got the thumbs up from them to say, yeah, you do have the right to defend yourself and we're with you. But the most important thing that's not being talked about much, and you've got the direct expertise to comment on this, is that when the Chinese convened, I think it was 14 or 15 of the Palestinian groups in Beijing, and had them sign basically a peace accord among them that they were going to all row in the same direction, it was 2 days later that the assassination of Hania took place. Do you think the Chinese looked at that and said, oh, no big deal, or they're now all in?
Well, I don't think the Chinese are all in because they're very cautious, risk averse. But I don't think the assassination was disconnected from that effort to produce unity. The Chinese are basically trying to unify various Palestinian factions in anticipation of a government in Gaza that is not dictated by Israel or the United States. Of course, not sure there'll be very much left of Gaza, given the lack of effective action. You can slather genocide with all the sweet talk and liberal nonsense that you want, wring your hands while sitting on them, and it does no good. So just to go back to the intelligence community, I'm not convinced that the intelligence community is as stupid as you suggest. On the other hand, we did the same thing in when the Russians demanded a negotiation over Ukrainian neutrality and NATO enlargement. We thought, oh, they'll never do anything. We left them with no path other than the military, and they took it. And I think there's a basic illustration here to be drawn, and that is intelligence failures almost never are failures of information. We have the information. Right. They happen when the information hits the brain of somebody who thinks that information is preposterous. It doesn't believe it because they have some kind of fixed thought in their head. And this doesn't conform to their narrative, therefore it can't be right. And, this is MacArthur. The Chinese will never respond if I go over the 38th parallel and get to the Yalu River. They won't do anything. Right. And intelligence, with loads of intelligence and warning that they would, and he just dismissed it. And the same thing was true in 2022 with the Russians in Ukraine. And I think it's probably true now if you're accurately portraying the conclusion. One of the things that bothers me about our intelligence community at the moment is that it's so bureaucratic and it is so politicized. You put on Pompeo at the start. Basically, it's being used as a platform for propaganda rather than as an authentic source of insight and information. And the guys who work there, I know a lot of them, and I've worked with them myself over the course of quite a long time. They are much better than that. And they don't deserve that.
Well, I was fortunate when I started as a new analyst that the fellow teaching my new analyst course was a guy named George Allen, not the not the coach of the Redskins, but he was the head of the Southeast Asia division during the Vietnam War. And
Right.
he
And
talked, you knew him?
I met him a couple of times. I
Well,
think it is, the worst thing you can do in either the Foreign Service or the intelligence service is be right when your boss believes something else.
yeah, that's well, and he one of the lessons he drove home to us, because he commented about the kind of political pressure he was facing. I mean, he was getting phone calls from Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor. And he said literally, they used the words, "Why aren't you being a team player?" And he
Get on
tried
the
to
team.
resist that. But he
Get on
also
the
said,
team.
yeah, be on the team. And he lamented a bit. He says, he wasn't in a position financially where he could really put his career at risk then, because he had two kids getting ready to go to college. And he talked to us about that. Now, the relevance of that to today is, when I was an analyst back in the 80s, uh, the analysts were separate still from the DO. We would interact, and I was a bit of a problem because I'd worked on the DO side as well, so I had good relations. But we still encountered that pressure from the covert action side when they had a policy they were pursuing, that if our analysis didn't square up with that, we were accused again of not being team players, of undermining it. What's happened today is those analysts have been brought over and are now part of these fusion centers, where the analysts sit right in there with the operations folks, and immediately that nobody could stand up and say, you know what, let me suggest that perhaps Vladimir Putin has a point. I mean, at that you're exiled.
This is a consistent problem. I actually believe that in 1947, with the National Security Act, we made a big mistake in putting analysis and operations in the same organization. And we've compounded the error. The classic example of what this does was the Cuban invasion debacle, Bay of Pigs. I mean, I knew a lot of the guys. I went to the University of Mexico at one point and speak Spanish, and I knew a lot of the Cubans who were there. And I also, quite by accident, bumped into the training camp in Guatemala where they were trained. I was hitchhiking and took the wrong fork in the road, and there was some beefy Marine standing there who didn't speak Spanish. So it's pretty obvious what was going on. But the problem there was the programmer, the people who are running the program, really don't want to hear anything that questions the program. And the more they work on a project, the more committed they get. And somebody has to stand up and say no, and it's not easy. I remember in the old executive office building, in the famous room where covert action is hatched, I was then the senior deputy for Africa at the State Department. And there was a proposal by a bunch of ignoramuses, I thought, to arm the Ethiopian exiles against the Mengistu government, which was a horror. It was a true horror. And I stopped it by saying, okay, it makes sense to me. Let's go to every cafe and bar in Vienna and Paris, round up the Ethiopian exiles and beat their teaspoons into swords and drop them over the border and watch what happens. Somebody's got to stand up and say, look, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, I had read Machiavelli. He has a great chapter on why you should never trust exiles, like what's his name in Iraq,
Well, there's one dynamic at play again that I think the intelligence community is ignoring, and certainly the policymakers and the politicians are ignoring. So in 2019, Russia and China conducted their first joint naval exercise with Iran.
Right.
Now, I've worked on military exercises for 24 years, scripting them and executing them. And I know that when you do a military exercise, that's a planning process. It usually starts at least 12, if not 18 months out previously.
Right.
So just doing the math, that means around middle of 2017 and no later than January of 2018, the Chinese and Iranians were talking about, hey, let's start cooperating from a military standpoint. So bring that forward to today. Iran's not standing there alone. What do you think all of this means?
Well, it certainly doesn't mean there's a Chinese defense commitment to Iran. What the Chinese began to get worried about, and you can date this to 2017, which is after the 2016 election, and the U.S. Overtly declaring China to be the adversary of choice or the pacing enemy threat in Defense Department language. What they began to get worried about was that the U.S. Navy, which had been protecting freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, where a good deal of their oil supply comes from, was now going to be more likely to interdict their oil supply than to protect it. And so they began to develop relationships with the navies in the region. They did an exercise with Iran, as you say, and the Russians too, and they did an exercise with the Saudis, and they've done exercises with the United Arab Emirates, and this coincided with their consolidation of a support base in Djibouti, because it looked to them as though we were about to threaten their strategic lines of communication and threaten their energy supply. So nothing happens without a reason, and that was the reason. The more interesting thing to me is that we just had a joint Chinese-Russian air patrol in the Alaskan Air Defense Information Zone, which staged out of a Russian base. That is, the Chinese took heavy lift aircraft there and their bombers and took off from a Russian base in the direction of Alaska. That is something we ought to be concerned about. And it gets me to the point that the stupidest thing we have done strategically is to push the Chinese and the Russians together. And make no mistake, we have done that. And now we've got Iran in there. And after we authorized Ukraine to fire weapons deep into Russia, the Russians pondered, what should they do? Vladimir Putin announced that he would not go to the nuclear level that he had threatened. Instead, he would arm the enemies of the United States wherever they were. Then he went off to Pyongyang and signed up the North Koreans, who apparently are sending engineering brigades to help with the Ukraine war, as well as ammunition. He went to Vietnam, which I don't suppose the Chinese were delighted about, but reestablished that relationship, balancing our influence there. And I think he thought seriously about arming the Houthis until the Saudis talked him out of it. And he is definitely arming Iran. When Sergei Shoigu went there as the national security advisor to the Putin government, he carried a letter offering to mediate between Israel and Iran, which is something Russia can do because, unlike us, it has not foolishly ceased to talk to the Iranians. We can't do that. Our only response has to be military because we don't have any diplomatic capability at all. But along with Shoigu, as I understand it, came some heavy lift aircraft, probably bringing with them electronic warfare gear, at least, maybe missiles. And the level of cooperation between Moscow and Tehran is constantly increasing. Why? Because we treat them the same way. Basically, we don't talk to the Russians anymore. We don't talk to the Iranians. We don't talk to the Chinese. And, but we threaten all of them. And of course, we don't talk to North Korea. We have maximum pressure on it, which has succeeded in producing a nuclear threat from North Korea that didn't exist before. If you put people in a corner, they do stuff that you don't want them to do, which is one reason why you ought to sit down and reason with them. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
well, I was just saying, I had the opportunity to have a conversation with the deputy foreign minister of Russia in December. And it was, I mean, it was a small gathering, and it wasn't one of these political things. We were just actually able to have a conversation, and he was sincere and genuine in saying, "We don't know who to talk to. There's nobody for us to talk to." And it's just, and they've sort of accepted that the United States has lost its mind, and they've got to figure out a way to move forward.
Well, they think we are in the grip of psychosis, which is when imagine there are trolls under bridges and other things. And so that probably was Sergei Ryabkov, who's a very tough guy, very, very good diplomat. He fits the description you gave at the opening of this discussion. He's got an iron fist and a velvet glove, but he can be pretty plain spoken. And so I think he was honest in saying that there's nobody they can talk to. We don't listen anymore. We talk, we lecture. And if you want to see the quintessential demonstration of that, was the start of the Biden administration with Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, mastermind of the administration, maybe the real acting president for all I know, going to Anchorage, Alaska, meeting Chinese counterparts, the state counselor Yang Jiechi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and saying to them, "You are moral reprobates. We're going to try to hold you down. If we can, we'll push you back. But there are a couple of things we need you to do for us. Would you do them?" This is not diplomacy. And I don't know. You were a case officer, I assume. You want to recruit somebody, you don't do that. These techniques are very similar.
Well, I was never a case officer. I did work on the DO briefly for about a year.
Oh, okay.
But I've described it. This is like the United States conduct of foreign policy is like a dating guide written by a rapist.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Not bad. I'll remember that.
There's no romance in it. There's no trying to be actually interested in what the other person is. No even concept that you can develop a basis for friendship.
That's the key. The best case officers, the best diplomats have total credibility with the people they're talking to, because they don't lie. Maybe they have a false identity if they're a case officer, but they're straight. They're trying to build credibility for the moment when they, if in the case of the case officer, ask the guy to commit treason against his country. In the case of a diplomat, ask the guy to help influence his government to do the right thing. Anyway.
Well, I want to shift briefly to the Ukraine issue. Gary's got a couple of clips of our favorite Senator, Lindsey Graham. Pat Lang used to call him the little old lady from South Carolina.
That's a dirty thing to say, but
well, Pat's dead now, so he can. They can't go after him. But I want you to put yourself in the position that you're the deputy chief of mission at our mission in Kiev, and Senator Graham has just come to town, and here's what he said.
What I think about Kursk: bold, brilliant, beautiful. Keep it up. Putin started this, kick his ass. Bottom line is, to the administration, I appreciate your support. Let these people fight. Give them weapons they need to win a war they can't afford to lose.
And Gary got the one more from him.
When it comes to F-16s, way too long. They're here. Let's use them. Let's train Ukrainian pilots. When I talked to President Zelensky just a few minutes ago, if you're a retired F-16 pilot and you're looking to fight for freedom, they will hire you here. They're going to look throughout NATO nations for willing fighter pilots who are retired to come help them until they can get their pilots trained. So we're going to get these jets in the air sooner rather than later. and we're looking for pilots who are willing to fight for freedom as the Ukrainians train their own pilots.
Well, he's inadvertently validating Putin's charge that it is NATO that is behind the Kursk incursion, and NATO that is a threat to Russia. And indeed, the Kursk invasion, from the Russian point of view, validates the thesis that a NATO presence in Ukraine is a threat to the motherland. So I would say, with regard to Kursk, it's pretty obvious that the Ukrainians had three motives. First, buck up their own morale, because it's pretty low after all the terrible losses they've taken. Second, demonstrate to their foreign NATO, US, and European backers that they can still hurt the Russians, which is what it's all about. That's what we're in there for, and not to save Ukraine. We're in there to hurt the Russians. And finally, if they can take territory and hold on to it, they have a bargaining chip when the inevitable negotiation comes along, and they have some territory to trade for territory. It is brilliant, yes. Unfortunately, however, it's incredibly risky. And I note that also Senator Graham referred to mercenaries, basically flying F-16s. The Russians claim, and I don't know whether it's true or not, that the force in Kursk has a lot of foreign mercenaries in it, French and others, and that may or may not be true. But it's an illustration of how internationalized this conflict is. And I don't think Senator Graham understands what nuclear weapons can do. And I don't think, if he imagines that the Russians will only respond with, on a limited basis to the sort of thing that we're pushing on them, I think, he should think again. The Russians are very careful, restrained. They've limited the war in Ukraine. It's called a special military operation for that reason. But the F-16s, final observation, you're the military guy, not me, but my guess is that's going to turn out like the famous Abrams tanks.
Yeah.
They sent those in there, and they were going to turn the battlefield around, and they didn't. And we'll see how well the F-16s, flown by Ukrainians or mercenaries, measure up against the S-400 and other Russian air defense systems, which I think are probably the best in the world.
Yeah. Well, the real news out of that was Graham was admitting that our program to train all these pilots hasn't worked.
Of course.
They don't have any pilots.
Of course. Well, you can train a pilot for a while in Arizona or someplace, and then you send them to Ukraine, and they don't have combat experience. This is actually I'm reminded what Graham called for of the North Korean Air Force in the Korean War, much of which was piloted by Russian pilots. But they knew their equipment. They had actually trained against the Germans, who were pretty good trainers. And if you went up against the Wehrmacht, you learned a lot. So I'm very dubious about all this. And I think it overlooks the fact that, we were going to fight to the last Ukrainian, and Ukraine's run out of Ukrainians, basically.
Yeah. Well, I want to close out with one. This is a bigger, broader question, because I don't have good answers for it. I'm a little younger than you, but I still lived during the Cold War. And I remember the era of the fear of the Soviet Union and world communism, and that we were fighting this world communist wave. And yet throughout that entire period, we talked to Brezhnev, we talked to Andropov, you talked to Gromyko, we talked to them. And the same with Mao Zedong and others. And now jump ahead to the current Russia. And I've been there now in the last 8 months 3 times. And I was never followed. I've done counter surveillance, taught counter surveillance. I was a nobody. Nobody is paying attention to me, number one. Number two, I hardly saw any police on the streets. Number three, the stores and things were just filled. I mean, you'd think you were in some major U.S. in the good shopping center in the good old days. And yet we have this animus towards Russia that seems so much deeper and darker than anything I experienced during the Cold War. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are a lot of complex factors there. You know, after the end of the Cold War, we had an opportunity to transform NATO into a European-wide cooperative security organization. Could have managed European security issues like the Serbian-Kosovo question. And the Russians actually signed on to that. But we have a couple of things that pushed us in a different direction. One was we have large populations of people from countries that were under Russian rule and who have a well-founded dislike, antipathy, fear of Russian aggression. So if you're a Polish American or a Hungarian American or something, or a Slovak or something, you have a fear of Russia, and that shows up at the polls. So Bill Clinton immediately started courting all the Eastern European captive nation voters, and that moved him in the direction of expanding NATO in a belligerent manner. Second, we have neocons. Our foreign policy is essentially neoconservative, and it's all military all the time. There's no diplomacy, as we were talking about earlier. The only instrument of statecraft we seem to have are sanctions and the Marines, maybe the Army too, but mostly the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines. And so Russia, I think, tried very hard to become part of the world, part of Europe, and we didn't want it. And we got a very clear warning in 2007 at the security conference in Munich from Vladimir Putin. He said, look, if you keep doing what you're doing, I'm going to have to react. He was echoing something that his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, had said in 1994. And this culminated in the December ultimatum from Russia, basically. Either you talk to us about our concerns about security in Europe, or we're going to take military action. And as we discussed, we didn't believe it. On the other hand, we did use the intelligence community to tell everybody, well, he's going to do it. So on the one hand, we didn't believe it, but on the other hand, we made propaganda about it. I can't, it's pretty hard to think of getting more confused than that.
Right.
But I think we may be about to do that again with Iran, as we were discussing. Lots of propaganda and no insight. And, how many people do we have who really understand the Iranians at this point?
No, very few.
And
go ahead.
During the year-long era of our effort to contain the communist China and overthrow its government, I have talked to the guys in New Delhi who worked with the CIA to get the Dalai Lama in trouble in Tibet and move him out. We made a big effort. Some of it was quite skillful. During that whole period, when we weren't talking to the Chinese government at all, we paid a price. It was only when we began to talk that we began to make progress. And we were able to set aside the prospect of war over Taiwan for quite a while until we abandoned our commitments there. And basically adopted an ideological approach to Taiwan. Taiwan is a robust democracy. It's admirable in many, many ways. So are the French, and we don't think because they're Democrats we have to follow their advice. And I would say we lack judgment.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had the power to drag you back into government, put you over at State Department to help try to put that place back in order. But you've deserved your retirement. you don't need the extra grief, but I know you're still a fundamental patriot that would still work for the benefit of your country.
I served the country for 30 years with pride. It was not the same country as it is now.
Yeah.
I'm 81. I shouldn't be in charge of anything, and my wife agrees with that. So let's leave it there.
Okay. Well, Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for taking this time and again sharing your knowledge and experience. On behalf of Danny Davis and Deep Dive, please remember to subscribe if you haven't. Click the like button, and then go below and in your comments thank Ambassador Freeman for all that he's done. I'm Larry Johnson. You can follow me at sonar21.com. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.